Shalom, shalom. We are continuing our limud of Sefer Yehoshua, and today we're going to begin with Perek Yudbetz, chapter 12. And this is a bit of a summary. The preceding chapter had concluded that Yehoshua had conquered over a long period of time. This is 7 years. He had conquered most of the territory. We will see that it's not all of the territory, but most of the territory that Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu that the Jewish people should conquer. He had extinguished the various nations who inhabited Canaan that were Rishoyim and that were evildoers. And the chapter ended, Ha'aretz shakta mimilchama. The land rested from war. It was tranquil after a 7-year period. So Perek Yudbetz begins with a summary statement. Eila malchei ha'aretz asher hiku b'nei Yisrael vayirshu es artzam. The following chapter will be a listing of the kings that the Jewish people had vanquished and inherited their territory. But first, it starts off with a bit of a review, because you'll recall that already at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, in the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu, on the east bank of the Jordan River, the Jewish people had conquered the land of Sichon, the king of Amori, and Og, the king of Bashan. And after this land was conquered, the tribes of Ruvain and Gad, and later they were joined by half of the tribe of Manasseh, wanted that land because it was very fertile and they had a lot of flocks. And Moshe Rabbeinu made them promise that if they will cross the Yarden westward and fight with the rest of the Jewish people, they will be given this land on east of the Yarden. Otherwise, they will not be given this land. So the whole book of Yehoshua does discuss the fact that Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe were faithful to their promise, and therefore it starts off talking about their boundaries east of the Yarden, and then it will move into the new land that was conquered west of the Yarden. So in terms of Eiver HaYarden Mizracha, in terms of the other side of the Yarden to the east, Mizrach HaShemesh, from the east of the sun, so that boundary is generally described Minachal Arnon ad Har Chermon v'chol ha'arava Mizracha. So the land that was conquered starts from the river Arnon. This is a very important boundary. This is a boundary that the Torah itself mentions a number of times. Nachal Arnon is a wadi, it's kind of a river stream coming from kind of the south-central part of the Dead Sea. So if you can imagine a map, look at the Yam HaMelech, the Dead Sea, and Nachal Arnon is the southern boundary of the Eiver LaYarden conquest of the kingdom of Sichon. And this conquest, which includes Sichon and Og, goes all the way from Nachal Arnon, going north, all the way to Mount Chermon, V'chol ha'arava, and all of the river plain, Mizracha, going to the east of the Jordan River. So that is a description of the entire Eiver HaYarden conquest. But remember that the conquest has two parts. There is the land of Sichon Melech HaEmori, that is the southern portion, and then there is the northern portion of Og Melech HaBashan. So after Pasuk Aleph described the entire Eiver HaYarden conquest, it then splits it into the Sichon component and the Og component. Sichon Melech Amori Yehoshua b'Cheshbon. Sichon, the mighty king of the Amori, who dwelt in Cheshbon. Cheshbon was his capital city. Moshel, he was ruling. Me Arorer, from a city called Arorer, which is in the south, and it is Al Sfas Nachal Arnon. Remember, Nachal Arnon is the southern boundary, so Arorer is literally on the shores of Nachal Arnon, V'tocha Nachal. And indeed, part of the city was even a little island that was in the middle of Nachal Arnon, and that is the beginning of Sichon's territory. And that goes, Chatzi Galal, that includes going north, that includes a mountainous area called Gilad, and that was Chatzi Gilad, because we'll see that Og controlled the other half of the Gilad, Ad Yabok HaNachal. So Sichon's territory extended from Nachal Arnon until Nachal Yabok. Now, Nachal Yabok is also a river or a wadi or a stream that comes out of the Dead Sea, but much further north. So between Arnon to the south and Yabok to the north, that is the boundaries of Sichon's kingdom that was conquered by Am Yisrael. If you have a good memory, you will recall that the night before Yaakov meets Esav as he is returning to Eretz Yisrael, he crossed the Nachal Yabok with his family. So again, the land of Sichon is from Nachal Arnon ad Yabok HaNachal, and Gevul B'nai Ammon. And even though Sichon goes from Arnon to Yabok, but eastward it stops at the boundary of Ammon, because Sichon was not able to conquer Ammon. So here, this is a very complicated. Geography is always very, very difficult to reconstruct. There are many, many different opinions. But here, too, I have to go over some basic information in the Torah. And that is, we know that Ammon and Moab are the children of Lot. And they originally inhabited land Aver Yarden. And because Ammon and Moab are connected to Avram Avinu, we are not permitted to take their land. So any territory that belongs to Ammon and Moab, we are not permitted to make a milchama against, and only limot HaMashiach will we get the land of Ammon and Moab. However, Sichon, the king of Amori, conquered the Moabite territory between Arnon and Yabok, and the Gemara lays down a principle in Maseches Gittin and Maseches Chulin that Ammon and Moab tiaru b'Sichon, that Ammon and Moab, in other words, the parts of Ammon and Moab that were conquered by Sichon, now become available to us because we are not taking the land away from Ammon and Moab. We are taking the land away from Sichon, who is Amori, right? He's not an Ammoni or Moabi. So what it's making the point here was that although Sichon was able to conquer the territory from Arnon to Yabok from the Moabites, thereby making it accessible to us, Sichon was not able to penetrate the boundary of Ammon to the east because the Ammonites were more powerful than the Moabites, at least in that particular stretch of territory, and therefore, if that remained shaykh to the Bnei Ammon, we were not able to capture that type of territory because whatever belonged to Ammon or Moab was unavailable to us. Similarly, the Moabites still controlled territory south of Nachal Arnon, and we were not able to conquer that because we were not allowed to, and that is why our boundaries of Eretz Sichon goes from Arnon to the south, Yabok to the north, and it goes as far east as the boundary of Ammon, which Sichon was never able to capture. That's the kind of basic story here. Now, then it goes on that after you go from Arnon to Yabok, so you're almost near the northern edge of the Dead Sea, Sichon did control part of the plain going north of the Dead Sea all the way to the Yam Kinneret, V'harava, ad Yam Kinrot, an unusual nikud, not Kinneret, but Yam Kinrot, Mizracha, ad Yam Harava, going down to the Dead Sea, Yam HaMelech, Mizracha, Derech Beit HaYeshimot, and the boundary of Sichon passed through the area that was known as Beis HaYeshimot, Umi Teiman, and south, again around Nachal Arnon, was Tachas Ashdot HaPiska. Again, what these are is not so clear to us, but Ashdot HaPiska literally means the waterfalls from the heights, that apparently there were mountains in the area of the Dead Sea that had running waterfalls, and that was the southern boundary. So that is the land of Sichon. Now, when you go north of the Kinneret, you now have the Bashan. Again, this corresponds more or less to the Golan Heights, and this is already the boundary of Og, the king of Bashan. And Og was very special. He was technically an Amori, but he was Miyeser Harifaim. He was one of the last of the great giants, the legendary giants, Hayoshev Biashtarot Ubiedrei, and he dwelt in his two capital cities, Ashtaros and Edrei, and we conquered his territory as well. Again, you're going north and further to the east. Okay, so south from Arnon to Yabok, and then a certain stretch from Yabok to the Yam Kinneret, bounded on the east by the Ammonite Gavul, is the land of Sichon, and then north of that is the land of Bashan, and again that extends further east as well, which is Og Melech HaBashan, Umoshel Bahar Hermon. Og did control the area of Mount Hermon, Uvesalcha, Uvechala Bashan, Ad HaGavul HaGeshuri VaMachasi. And he went as far north as the boundary of two nations. Now, these nations are not Canaanite nations. They're the nation of Geshur and the nation of Ma'acha. And although they did live in parts of Eretz Yisrael, we will see further on, we were never able to totally dispossess them. The Geshuri and the Machasi and Chatzi Gilad. And in addition, part of the Gilad, again, that's the mountainous area between the Yam HaMelech and the Kinneret. So half of the Gilad, we said, belonged to Sichon, and the other half of that Gilad belonged, the northern half, belonged to Og Melech HaBashan. So this is all, remember, this is not Yehoshua's conquest. This is the conquest of Moshe Rabbeinu, and Pasuk Vav says, Moshe Eved Hashem Uvnei Yisrael Hikum. Moshe, the servant of Hashem. Remember, I mentioned the Radak more than once, that Moshe is called Eved Hashem, because by an Eved, Masha Kana Eved Kana Rabo, whatever an Eved acquires belongs to his master. Everything Moshe was, all of his amazing abilities, his kaichais, his talents, were given legamre to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Moshe, as an Eved Hashem and Bnei Yisrael Hikum, smote Sichain Melech HaEmori and Og Melech HaBashan, Vayitna Moshe Eved Hashem Yerusha Liruveni V'lagadi V'lachatzi Shevet HaMenashe. So again, there's going to be a certain amount of repetition that's difficult for us to understand, particularly in a Bikiyas Shir that is not emphasizing Eon. Let me just point out that in this perek, we are not yet being told what went to Ruvain, what went to Gad, and what went to the Chatzi Shevet Menashe. At this point, we are simply making a general statement that we have the land that is called the land of Sichon, and we have the land that is called the land of Og. Collectively, that land was divided among 2.5 tribes east of the Yarden. We will see in the next perek what did Reuven get, what did Gad get, and what did the Chatzi Shevet Menashe get. So, after we finished a description of the land that is east of the Jordan, we now mention the kings that Yehoshua had vanquished in the 7 years of battle after the death of Moshe. V'ela Malchei Haaretz, the following is the list of the kings of the land, Asher Hika Yehoshua Uvnei Yisrael, Be'aver HaYarden Yama. So now we're talking about the other side of the Yarden to the west, Eretz Yisrael. Mibal Gad Bibikas HaLevanon, and the conquest extends from a far north city or town, Baal Gad, in the Lebanon plains, or the Lebanon fields, Ad Hahar HaChalak HaOles Seira, going all the way south to the smooth mountain that goes up to Seir. Now again, this is not a full description of the southern boundary, but you will recall that Seir is Esav, who was called a man of hair, etc. Actually, Seir was also his father-in-law, but Eretz Seir, Mount Seir, which is a mountainous area in the south, around Petra of Jordan, is where Esav lived. And just as we were not allowed to conquer the land of Ammon and Moab, because that was promised to them, because of their connection to Avram Avinu, we were certainly also not allowed to conquer the land of Seir. So the southern boundary goes until the mountain that takes you to Seir, because that's Esav's territory. And north of that point is part of what we conquered. Vayitne Yehoshua l'shiftei Yisrael Yerusha kamach l'kosam. And Yehoshua is now going to divide this as an inheritance among 9.5 tribes, and this includes Har, mountainous areas, Shevela, valleys, Arava, plains, Ashdos, waterfalls, Midbar, deserts, Negev, the southern desert, and the land of the Chiti, Amori, Haknani, Haprizi, Hachivi, Vahayavusi, the land that was occupied until it was conquered by 6 of the 7 nations of Canaan. You will recall there was a 7th nation, Girgashi, that is almost never mentioned, and that is because Yehoshua sent a proposal that any nation that wants to flee the land is free to leave, and the Girgashi actually left Eretz Yisrael, and they were saved from expulsion, and that is why, although we talk about Eretz Canaan as the land of the 7 nations, in point of fact, there was only 6 of those nations that Yehoshua actually fought with, because the Girgashi were gone. Let me point out that this process of tribal division, which will take up several chapters in Yehoshua, very, very difficult chapters, geographically, took 7 years. There were 7 years of military battle, and 7 years of dividing the land and allocating the land and determining how much land each family should take. That was a very long and laborious process. So now we have a listing of kings. The Malbim makes a very important observation that not every king did we conquer territory, meaning sometimes we conquered the king and the territory. Other times we were able to kill the king, but we didn't necessarily get the territory. For example, we're going to see that one of the kings that is enumerated is the king of Yerushalayim. He was killed. He was captured and he was killed. But Yerushalayim itself we did not conquer really until much later, all the way indeed, even after the judges, all the way in the time of David HaMelech. So consequently, this list is a list of kings. It is not necessarily a list of territory, although for most of the kings we also got their territory. We're going to see there's a list of 31 kings, right? This is a famous expression in Chazal. They talk about the 31 kings that Yehoshua vanquished. And according to the halacha, if you're writing the Navi on a cloth, like many shuls follow the minhag, follow the halacha actually, that the Haftarah should be read from a Megillah, from a scroll written with all of the halachas of Kisvei HaKodesh. And the halacha is that the 31 kings must be written in a certain way, like a poem, but it's different than most shiros. Most shiros in the Torah, such as Oz Yashir, you have what is called Ariach al Gabi Levena, half brick on top of a whole brick, meaning to say you have a short line, and next line is longer, short, long, short, long, short, long. So it's like a half brick on top of a foundation of a longer brick. Here, for the 31 kings, you just write one king on top of another king, meaning it doesn't have a base, meaning the small name is on top of another name, and you don't have a foundation of a levena. And if you put that into a physical image, that means you knock them over. They don't have a tekuma, they don't have a base to stand upon, and that's a remez that they had no kiyum, they have no basis. And we just had Purim, and you'll recall that in a Megillah, the Aseres B'nai Haman are written in exactly the same way. Instead of Ariach al Gabi Levena, it's Ariach al Gabi Ariach. It's a small brick on top of a small brick. Shalo Tehei Tekuma, that they have no standing, they have no basis. So we now give the list of the names. There's not a lot to say on them. I'm just going to read it very quickly. Melech Yericho Echad, the first was the king of Yericho. Melech Ha'ai, Asher Mitzad Beisel Echad, the second was the king of Ai, which is next to Beisel. Now, there we of course got both the city and the king. Now, number 3 is Melech Yerushalayim Echad, but there we did not get the territory. Melech Hebron Echad. So there I mentioned Hebron, there was a bit of a problem. It does say we vanquished the king of Hebron. The implication would be that we conquered Hebron, but we're going to see that there were parts of Hebron that were in fact not conquered or subjugated until later. Again, going on with the kings. Melech Yarmus Echad, Melech Lachish Echad, Melech Eglon Echad, Melech Gezer Echad, Melech Devir Echad, Melech Geder Echad, Melech Charma Echad, Melech Arad Echad, Melech Livna Echad, Melech Adulam Echad. Again, this is both north and south. Melech Makeda Echad, Melech Beis El Echad, Melech Tapuach Echad, Melech Chefer Echad, Melech Afek Echad, Melech Lasharon Echad, Melech Madon Echad, Melech Chatzor Echad, Melech Shimron Meron Echad, Melech Achshaf Echad, Melech Tanach Echad, Melech Megiddo Echad, Melech Kedesh Echad, Melech Yoknaam LeCarmel Echad, Melech Dor Linafas Dor Echad, Melech Goyim LeGilgal Echad. Interesting title. The Goyim LeGilgal, kind of assorted nations near Gilgal. Gilgal was the main camp of the Jewish people. Melech Tirza Echad, and it ends Kol Milachim Shaloshim V'Echad. Now again, let me point out two things. Point number one I already made. Vanquishing the king did not automatically mean we control the territory. Point number two is, as you go through the listing of the kings, some of the battles are described in earlier parts of the Sefer. Yericho, we have a whole description. But many of these cities we only know from this listing, meaning the point is simply this: there are many wars in the book of Yehoshua that are not otherwise described. They're simply listed as a king that we vanquished. So not every city gets a whole story as to what we did. So that concludes Perek Yud Beis.